Welcome to the Messy City Podcast, where we talk with the people who design, plan, build, develop, or even just think about how to create beautiful, successful, and humane cities and towns. Let's learn from each other and create places we truly care about. Welcome back to the Messy City Podcast. This is Kevin Klinkenberg. A few months ago, we lost one of the real greats in the world of architecture and urban design, Leon Krier, who passed away on June 17th at the age of 79 years old. I first became aware of Krier when I was in architecture school, where he was not thought of very fondly, I would say, at the time. But he certainly had an incredible influence on a lot of us who practiced in architecture and urban design, especially those in the world of the new urbanism. And I was thinking about who to have on to talk about Leon Krier, and I turned to my old friend Dan Perolik to join us. Dan, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Kevin. It's great to be back. Thank you for having me again.
You bet. I wanted to have Dan because not only is Dan a big thinker about so much related to architecture and urban design, but he also had a lot of direct experience working with Krier. And so we have the opportunity to talk about the man, not just his ideas, but the person. I think it's it's timely and important to talk about him because he had such a big influence on so many people. So Dan, thanks for doing this. So there's a lot. I know we have a lot we can talk about. I think maybe where we should start is just talk about like your first introduction to. Well, how about did you first hear about Krier, the architect or the theorist?
Yeah, so it was when I was in architecture school at Notre Dame, and I had a bit of a different experience than you because I was at
Yeah.
probably the only architecture school in the country that was suggesting we read Leon Krier's books and look at his because the program my architecture class was the first class at Notre Dame with the shift to the program toward a Beaux-Arts training, which was super interesting at the time. And so I remember very early on having his books on my desk. And I think that the first book that I discovered was Houses, Palaces, and Cities. And I think that was a book that he wrote in 1985. So it was a few years before I was in architecture school. But I think between that and then there was a project that he worked on called Atlantis that he designed for a client, sort of a hypothetical cultural think tank that he designed. And I remember there's a book on it as well that I remember just calling through the design of it and looking at the public spaces, the architecture. I think between those two books, they were very foundational to my thinking about urban design and architecture. And I think if you think about, all the diagrams that you see of his, a lot of them were in houses, palaces, and cities. And the everything from the idea of the polycentric city, right, is just really what seems really basic, but at the time was really kind of radical thinking to there are a couple of favorites that I had. It was there's one called Distance and Detail, a diagram that has a contemporary building and a traditional building, and it shows like from a far distance, a mid distance, and a close distance, how on a traditional building, the closer you get, the more visual information there is, and in a modern building, there's not. And then all his like city and parasite diagrams. Like all those to me were just like, wow, this is great. This is really great thinking and very inspirational at the time. So that at architecture school for me was really the foundation of our introduction, I guess is probably a better way to say it, of Leon Krier to me. I was just really fortunate to have mentors at the time that were, suggesting we read these books
Yeah.
and actually talking about them in our classes, which is very different from the
Yeah.
experience that you and 99.9% of other architecture students had and still have, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's something about the Gen X, right? We were, right, studying architecture at the time where I mean, he started in the 70s, but it was just starting to gain momentum.
Right.
Um, and more so in the US, I think, than in the sort of the late 90s or late 80s and early 90s.
Yeah. Well, it may be worth taking a minute and talking a little bit about why his ideas would not have been welcomed in architecture school for people who are not as clued in as we are to the bizarro world of getting an architecture degree. How would you describe like why his ideas would be controversial at all?
Um, I mean, it still baffles me that it's an issue, but there's something about the way that architecture is typically taught that really discourages and even frowns upon sort of looking back at the past and learning from it and reflecting that, using it as a precedent for your architecture work and your urban design and planning work. And I think it's just really as simple as that. Unfortunately, it's like, right, as you see this all the time, it often like immediately gets classified as cliche or too sentimental or like. So I really that's just the reality of the way the architecture profession works and teaches its students, unfortunately. I
Yeah.
mean, how would you how do you feel? What else would you add to that? Because
Well,
I
I
think we
just
all have had different experiences.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much that he wrote about that goes against the prevailing orthodoxy of architecture school, which is like as you said, the history of actual architecture starts in about 1915. In most architecture schools, with the
Yeah.
Bauhaus. And
Yeah.
everything else before that is this really ancient stuff built by previous civilizations that we can only study like as relics or anthropology. And I think he really picked up like the human aspect of that and the human tradition of architecture being very steeped in that in his world. And and so he sort of really revived the theoretical underpinnings for why it would be good to build buildings or cities that look like we did for millennia. And that's just really challenging fundamentally to how architecture is thought of and taught.
Yeah, and I think that when I was looking back a little bit at the early history of both my introduction and sort of his early influence, I was really I had forgotten about this the Venice Biennale
Oh yeah.
in 1980 that Paolo Portoghese put together in Venice, and there was an exhibit called Strada Novissima, and Krier and a bunch of these other early postmodernists, sort of traditionalists had, including Thomas Gordon Smith, who was the
Mm.
person who started Notre Dame's program, they were part of this exhibit, which, right, historically and even currently, usually sort of introduces and highlights the most avant-garde, thinking of the time. And so it was interesting that at that point in history in 1980, like there were people that were like, yes, this is avant-garde, and we
Yeah.
do need to be thinking and talking about this. So that was super interesting to kind of dig back up and look at some of those images and realize that the work that they had to do, in the 1970s and
Yeah.
80s to just even be heard and sort of get an audience. And I think that I would imagine it'd be interesting to talk to, I mean, maybe some of the urbanists that are a generation ahead of us, of like how that shifted their careers, or just the dialogue large, like in 1980,
Hmm.
professionally. But that it's interesting to see that, and I think that, his, outside of the architecture, right, his urbanism diagrams are so
Oh,
powerful
incredible.
and so impactful and so easy to understand
Yeah.
that in a lot of ways I feel it's probably influenced a lot of us in terms of how we communicate about what we do. Even like the missing middle diagram, right? Maybe it's likely that, you know,
Hmm.
understanding how you can do something visually and impactfully and have it resonate with a lot of people, is, I think that's just a seed that his work, amongst 100 other things, sort
Yeah.
of planted in my head
Yeah. I think,
very early on in my urbanism and architecture training.
yeah. And I think that's probably what pissed a lot of people off is he had these really simple, like diagrams that were almost cartoonish, but they were so clear in their communication about, what he saw as good versus what he saw as bad in terms of design. And I mean, we've all probably used his sketches in various
Yeah.
presentations. One of the ones I used to always use was the city as a pizza diagram, where he would talk about, you don't, when you're just talking about the urban planning of a city, you don't think about like the pepperoni's over here and the cheese is over here and the crust is over here. No, like a city is like a pizza where if you cut a slice, it should have all elements of life. And that was just such a clear communication that, it always gets a laugh, but it's also just, it, amazingly clear in its communication.
Yeah.
So
And
I want to
for,
also talk a little bit about, then as you started to do have some of your personal experiences with Leon, um, talk about like your first introduction to actually dealing with him as a person.
yeah, in 1999, 2000, right after I had graduated with a master's degree in urban design from UC Berkeley, I and launched Opticos, and that's when you and I met, about right at that time. Um, I entered a design competition called the Millennium Gate, and it was for a gateway for Washington, D.C. And I ended up winning the design competition, and Leon Krier was one of the jurors in that competition. So there was an event and a charrette process, and so that was my first. I mean, it was a little bit starstruck at that point of sort of that overlap, but um, I was also real in about 2002. Leon Krier walked into our offices with Robert Davis to talk about doing some work in Seaside. So you can imagine, pretty early on in my career, and I think we were a company of 3 or 4 people at the time in a converted apartment, above the bagel shop in our neighborhood, and having Leon Krier and Robert Davis walk in. So we um, we had the fortunate experience of collaborating with Leon on the Seaside, sort of the town square and the beachfront master plan over the course of about 6 years, which was, I just remember him sitting down in that initial meeting and doing his like little career sketches of seaside, over the seaside, existing seaside plan, and he had this really super interesting concept of circling the wagons and building in the interior of the seaside square. Um, and So we were also designing the as part of the master plan. We were also designing the market buildings flanking his tower. So there's a really close collaboration that needed to happen in terms of how the market buildings would meet the design of his new seaside tower. And uh, so that was a multi-year collaboration. We have a stack of faxes that are about 3 inches tall. That's how he used to communicate. We would fax him something, and he would sketch over it and fax it back. And he, in addition to just being a genius at design at all scales, he was a really good person and had a sense of humor because looking back, I remember seeing a fax that had like, for my tower, you need to change this profile here on the site plan, master plan, you need to change, shift these things around. And then he had like this little blimp sketch tied onto his tower that said obey on it. Like he just like this really interesting sense of humor and sort of lightheartedness that he didn't take himself too seriously. That was great, great, really great person to work with. And in go ahead.
No, I was going to say, what else in that period did you kind of just learn about him as a person or as an individual?
Yeah, it's number one, he there's a lot of architects in his position of sort of notoriety that just aren't really they're just not very approachable or sort of easy to work with. And he was a person that could have had a sort of chip on his shoulder, but he was always very collaborative. And a couple of personal things about him that people might not have known is that he also just really liked Americana. And like when we did a charrette at Seaside, and he loved just hanging out with the group of us and like watching bad American films and eating American junk food. And he the other interesting thing we found out is that he had this interest in the American West, and read a lot of Louis L'Amour novels that were set in the Gold Rush era in the Sierra foothills. And so at some point while we are working with him, we actually took him out to a project we were working on in Grass Valley called Loma Rica Ranch that was in Grass Valley, a Sierra foothill town, and he was just in awe of sort of actually being in the place that these novels were set in that he was super personally interested in.
And in your collaborations with the work on Seaside, how did that impact your own like professional work, or uh, maybe talk a little bit about how just that kind of direct experience working hand in hand, like what that did to your own just evolution as a designer?
Yeah, I think that whether you realize it or not, when you're actually working with the people that are at that level, and I've been fortunate to sort of been exposed to, like I worked with Robert Stern in New York City, and um, a lot of my mentors at when I was at Notre Dame, and like Michael Lakudis and Norm Crow, and then at UC Berkeley, like Dan Solomon, Alan Jacobs, Donlin Linden of like the Charles Moore lineage, just crossing paths with all those people. And I think I you don't really realize how much you're absorbing and learning from those people until you reflect back on it and sort of realize that even just spending time on a project with those people, you're learning so much about their design process, their communication process, and the I think in a lot of ways it's just like the you're absorbing the genius, like the in Krier it was like the urbanist genius of like that. I feel probably like there's not like a direct. I can't say like he did this and it influenced me in this way, but I think just being in the same room with somebody like that and working on a project together, you just really learn a lot over the course of several years that um, you know in terms of design strategy, um, that it's really invaluable. And I think the polycentric city was an idea that um, the seed was planted with Houses, Palace, and City in undergraduate school, and I was able to integrate sort of those ideas into my master's thesis, which was a growth strategy for a city called Modesto in the Central Valley, which had a housing focus. And then if you look at a lot of Opticos's work, that works at the citywide and the regional scale, whether it be like an island-wide strategy for Kauai County to Memphis comprehensive plan, that polycentric idea is inherent and foundational in all of that work. And it seems so basic in a lot of ways, but it's just not the way that most plans are done or most urban designers or planners think. And it was that same idea of the polycentric city was a thread that went through the work that we all did on the Merriam Park project with Leon in Chico and the work in downtown Las Vegas at about the same time. And we've got polycentric diagrams, the Krier diagrams of both of those projects, right? And um, it's like I said, I really enjoyed going back and sort of reflecting on that and pulling it out and looking at it for the first time in 15 plus years and kind of understanding how it all added up to um, heavily informing the approach and the critical design thinking and design solutions that we bring to our work from a private sector project to, like I said, the planning and zoning projects that we've been working on for 25 years now.
So maybe you could dive into that a little bit deeper and talk about for somebody who's not as familiar with like the notion of the polycentric city, like what's different or unique about that as opposed to maybe how other planning is done.
Yeah, the foundational idea is that you always have a urban form hierarchy that has a center, or it be a neighborhood main street or a small village high street. And then that that is the focal point of a walkable neighborhood or a walkable village. And as a city grows, you don't grow around that individual center, but you grow around, like there might be the establishment of a new center that then the city will grow around. And um, this it reminds me of one of the diagrams in his Houses, Palaces, and Cities book, which I mentioned earlier, which is the city and the parasite. It's an image of it says city without a suburb, and it's like a really compact, small town with that historic center, and then that's the organizer of the village, and the center point, and then a city with a suburb, which is like that individual point with the city spreading and where there's no real additional hierarchy around how it grows, and then suburb without a city. And it's just, there's no hierarchy in the suburb. It's just kind of the same thing built horizontally across the landscape. And then the idea of cities within a city. And that's really what this polycentric idea is whether you call it a city within a city or a neighborhood within a city, it always is organized around hierarchically around a focal point, and that's the organizer for growth. And so an example of how we've used that in our work is a little over 10 years ago, we did a county-wide growth strategy for Beaufort County, South Carolina, and there were existing small towns that were identified as existing centers that were sort of reinforced in the planning we did and the zoning form-based coding that we wrote as growth, but then we had to identify outside of those existing towns where it makes sense from a infrastructure connectivity standpoint to establish a new center that would have some sort of a mixed use element for commerce, for services and amenities, and then organize the walkable growth around it. And that's really the only way you can get to compact walkable urbanism. And I think whether you call it walkable urbanism, new urbanism, urbanism, that's kind of very foundational, that sort of hierarchy. And uh, I would say if you're a budding urbanist or a new urbanist, like start with understanding the polycentric city and what the components are, right? To me, it's foundational to a more sustainable, um, walkable environment.
So you and I had this opportunity to work on this crazy project in Las Vegas a long time ago. That was sort of an extension of the historic downtown Las Vegas strip, the original strip. And that was one of those sort of short and sweet design efforts we did. But um, I wonder if you could talk about how the thinking that you learned and how we applied that in that project, in that master plan, which ended up being unrealized, but it would have, if it had been realized, was have been a pretty remarkable change for downtown Las Vegas.
Yeah, it's so yeah, super interesting project. I was trying to remember. It was Bob Kramer, right, the developer of Hale Village, and Jeff Fleeman, who is his business partner, that brought us into this, you and me and the rest of the team into this, and Leon Krier. And I think there's probably very few people that know that Leon Krier worked in Las Vegas, and I think it's super interesting. And uh, I think what I realized we need to do is, University of Notre Dame now has a career archives. They he sort of made them responsible for curating his work, and so
Mm-hmm.
anybody that has content that was created while they were working with Leon Krier that's not sort of publicly available, I just encourage you to share that with the career archives. And I think this is one of those projects that I was like, of course we should share this because it's super unique. And right, the project was, our client was thinking about purchasing a series of legacy, um, casinos in the historic downtown of Las Vegas, which at the time in the early 2000s was outside of, Fremont Street, that one little block with the covered, uh, uh, the canopy over it was pretty desolate and pretty tired and run down. And right, I think part of why I think Bob is a lot of, like a lot of other new urbanist developers, are kind of just interested in this sort of intellectual exploration, partly. So we were fortunate to be part of it. But right, we looked at, they could have very easily said, let's just look at the buildings we're thinking about buying, but they said, let's think about if we buy these buildings and help put a framework in place for the short midterm revitalization and just rethinking of downtown Las Vegas, what sort of impact could we potentially have? And it was really fun. I can remember, there's a lot of like axonometric urban design framework diagrams that were done. Uh, Eric Oss was who was working with us at the time, was part of that team, did a lot of those little vignettes. I remember doing this, watercolor perspective looking down Fremont Street, of like what could this be, and it was a mid and high rise sort of what if strategy. That was one of the lots that, Bob and Jeff were looking at. And I remember this, very Krier-esque sort of informal terminated, view that had like layers of different buildings at different angles in it. And yeah, it was in at the same time, I also remember doing little sketches of courtyard housing types on a 50-foot typical lot size, right? Because that's, as the downtown transitioned away from that core, it very quickly became mostly single family, but some missing middle at the time. And so it was a really interesting process. There are clear polycentric diagrams that sort of, right, ideally would have served as a that organizing element or that hierarchy for how downtown Las Vegas uh, could could be rethought. And since then, Zappos relocated in downtown Las Vegas, and quite a bit has happened, but it's still, we did just do a form-based code project for the arts district, and that which is kind of the between the edge of downtown and the strip, which was pretty interesting, where some of the historic fabric still exists. But that it was a super interesting project. I'd be curious, like, why don't you share some of your what you remembered about that process? Because it was we were in a windowless room in a casino, like a banquet room, and I couldn't find any photographs, unfortunately, of the process. It was one of the processes where it was pre cell phone, pre smartphone.
Yeah. God. Yeah. I mean, all I remember about it was the entire experience just felt surreal. And working, like you said, in a casino,
Yeah,
the clients that were, I guess, the partners of Bob Kramer and Jeff were very, very interesting characters. And um, I remember the time thinking it was a super fun effort, and we loved working with Bob. We worked with them on multiple projects, Bob and Jeff, but it also just felt completely unreal. So, it, at the same time, I thought the work that produced was amazing. And if it had been able to be realized, unfortunately, Bob has passed away at a young
yep,
age.
yep,
If it had been able to be realized, it really would have been cool.
yeah. And little did we know we would
Yeah,
never do anything
yeah,
like it.
yeah. So then the other one I wanted to talk to you about was the Merriam Park charrette. So Merriam Park, this was in Chico, California, with our friends John Anderson and Tom DiGiovanni. So that one, I was actually supposed to be on the charrette, but I had to cancel because I think if I remember right, I was like double booked, so I didn't get to participate, which was always like to my great humiliation. Yeah. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know of any other large scale greenfield project that Leon Krier designed in the United States. Unfortunately, it didn't get implemented according to the vision necessarily. But um, I mean, it was the just a bunch of kind of the Gen X new urbanists were on that charrette. There was Peter Musty, Tony Cease, Howard Blackson, Jeff Dyer, um, and then Bill Ellison was also on that charrette, and Seth Harry was on that charrette. So the team was like this was a rock star, and Leon Krier obviously leading the design. So I think we were just all super interested in that collaboration, and it was 270 acres. I think it was about 3,000 homes were proposed, and I don't know, it was a lot, several 100,000 square feet of kind of mixed use commercial and retail, with a creek corridor splitting it. But I think what really intrigued me the most about this was seeing, and we saw a little bit of this in Las Vegas, of the American grid, and Leon Krier grappling with working within the parameters of the rigid American grid, and how he translated that into a new community plan, a series of new walkable neighborhoods in this Merriam Park charrette was super, super intriguing. And once again, these are all drawings that should be shared in the Krier archive so people have access to them. But right, the plan was a little bit more regular than he might typically do in like a project like Poundbury, or that project in like Atlantis that I mentioned earlier. But it was a really brilliant sort of uh, translation of his more European urbanist sort of knowledge to, I guess, trying to deliver something that's buildable in the U.S. but at the same time delivers a similar quality of walkability and urbanism. And that to me was the most intriguing. And so the blocks within this are semi-regular, but then he would break up the blocks, and he'd like one of his comments was the block doesn't need to follow the right of way. The block face doesn't need to follow the right of way. So he would like slightly shift the block face even as the right of way continued to go fairly orthogonal. So it was a way to get a little bit more of an organic pattern in the urbanism without um, you know, completely introducing a more um, traditional pattern that you might see in a European village. And um, one of the coolest um, new ideas that I'm not sure if it was a new idea at the charrette that he flushed out while he was on the charrette was he called it the TUA, and it was the test urban architecture, and it was the 9 ifs, and it was how a more he basically classified urbanism from more the most traditional or vernacular to the most classical or formal. And then he classified architecture from the most classical and formal to the most vernacular. And he talked about like when it's okay to introduce a more vernacular, informal architecture in a more formal urban framework, and sort of all the variations and pluses and minuses of vernacular urbanism, vernacular architecture to classical architecture and classical urbanism. And I have this one pager that was him one night summarizing those thoughts. And once again, it's just the genius in that systems thinking or that design thinking that he was just brilliant at, in trying to organize them in a way that he could communicate the benefits of a certain approach or just lay out a strategy of why you might decide to do a more vernacular or classical architecture or a more vernacular or classical urbanism, and how to combine them. It was super intriguing.
Yeah, I think that experience, that charrette, also deeply affected our mutual friend Howard Blackson, who then became a Krier aficionado and also ended up working with him a few times in San Diego and elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember seeing some of that work where once again, it was Leon trying to grapple with the rigidity of the American grid. And he was looking for ways to subtly shift the buildings outside of the right of way to make it less formal.
So, what if we zoom out and think about Leon's influence on the profession and the field? Um, where do you think this whole discussion of urbanism would be without him, and how does it get carried forward because he was such a unique individual?
Um, the more I look at it, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of discussions about this at CNU and probably has been on listservs that I'm not part of, but I the more I dig into it and talk to other people, I just did a symposium with Peter Calthorpe at UC Berkeley last week, and so we had lunch to prep for that. And I don't know, not sure how Leon Krier came up, but I think it was sort of the seaside connection that he was heavily influenced by Leon in the 1970s. And so, like, that obviously planted the seeds of Peter's kind of his new urbanist or urbanist thinking that, right, helped create the new urbanism. And I know Leon was floating around some of the Ivy League universities, I think, in the 70s and 80s when other new urbanist Liz Andres, Stefanos were, I think, either teaching there or studying there. I actually don't know, but I think his impact was really, to be honest, I began to wonder as I sort of looked into it and thought about it, is whether the new urbanism would have actually ever happened if Leon Krier, if he wasn't the person that he was and didn't do what he had done. Right? Because he even was super instrumental, from what I've read anyway, in the early history of Seaside and working with Liz and Andres and in sketching some of the early ideas of what seaside should be. So I think it's a great loss for urbanism. I think he's the type of practitioner that he got some things built, right? He got in the US, it's not a lot. He got his house in Seaside built, and it got re-renovated about 10 years ago. He got the School of Architecture at Miami. He got the Windsor Town Hall. But and then the two big new towns he's worked on were Poundbury and Ciudad Cayala in Guatemala. But so like he has some really great work built, but he's the type of practitioner that his impact was more about the theory and the sort of the books and the messaging and the inspiration and influence that had in my mind.
Yeah, and those two towns you mentioned, we didn't really touch on that very much yet, but Poundbury and the Guatemalan city are actually they're remarkable. They're absolutely remarkable, and he had an incredible influence. Well, I mean, he designed those and saw those through a lot of the construction, and they are great built examples for people to see and touch and walk through.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a funny Poundbury story. I've been there a couple of times now, but I was actually in England visiting some friends with my family, and I had young kids at the time, and we were on our way to the Jurassic Coast, which is where you can find fossils. And we were driving down the freeway, and I looked off to my right, and I was like, I just had this like, oh my God, that's Poundbury. And I was like, I basically forced my family to drop me off at Poundbury on the way back for a couple hours because I was like, I can't be this close to Poundbury and not see it. And it's an amazing project. And we've had the fortune to do some really fun work with formerly the Prince's Foundation, now the King's Foundation, Ben Bolgar and his team. And right, he has that history of just being able to work directly with Leon over the years, decades on that project and see his brilliance and just like he's shared a lot of really great stories as well that have just been amazing. But I do highly encourage anybody that hasn't seen Poundbury or the Guatemalan new city, Ciudad Cayala. I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, but I just encourage any urbanist to go on a schedule a journey to study those places.
Yeah, so and part of this is fresh in my mind. One of the other things he talked about a lot was the natural height limit of what he thought buildings should be, which is somewhere around 6 stories, because that's what a human could walk up and down stairs. That was fresh in my mind because I was just in DC last week, which is really the one city in the country that has sort of a height limit. And it's a remarkable experience, walking around the city. And again, his ideas were really pushing that was what we should be pushing towards as as the places that we build, as opposed to either single all like low scale or very high scale.
Yeah, it's really the most humanist scale, and I feel that whether you're looking at DC or I guess Paris is the other model, and I mean a lot of other European cities that sort of stayed at that 4, 5, and 6 stories. Um, I think I'm not the type of person that feel that there's not a place for bigger buildings, especially I think in existing cities. But I do feel like you can achieve a lot and probably deliver it, right? You can demonstrate that you can deliver similar population densities in 4, 5, 6 story buildings if you design it thoughtfully and achieve all the benefits of a walkable urban environment. And I mean, our work in the missing middle and the kind of thinking about now that more than half of American households want walkable urban lifestyles and living choices. I feel like that the 3 and 4 story missing middle scale, and then up to that 4 or 5 story scale are really a sweet spot where American households are really looking for it, and it's very hard to find it. That sort of that type of walkable urban living, or what we might call a missing middle neighborhood in the United States.
Yeah. So, Dan, what else is new with you and with Opticos? I did see a cool project recently outside of Athens, Georgia. What all are you working on these days?
Yeah, it's so our work still continues to be both public sector and private sector. And I think in the public sector, probably the most exciting project right now is we got hired to be the lead urban designers for the Rebuild Lahaina effort.
Oh,
And
wow.
so actually, my team just got back from Maui uh, last night. They just had a second charrette to look at the historic center of Lahaina. Obviously, very controversial, very contentious. Like, do you
Yeah.
rebuild as it existed? If not, what should it look in? Anyway, so that's a super exciting project, and that sort of uh, it came out of and I'm going to give my business partner Stefan Pellegrini credit. He's been working with Kauai County for over 15 years, doing really amazing work countywide, and has built a really strong presence and I guess a brand in the Hawaiian Islands, and sort of that led to us being hired by the Hawaii Community Foundation to do an island-wide missing middle housing strategy for Maui. And then that led into us being uh, invited to do lead the urban design for Rebuild Lahaina. And we're doing a lot of we regional missing middle work. We just and statewide. We just finished with the state of Utah state missing middle housing toolkit that
Hmm.
is now online. It launched, I think, 2 or 3 months ago. So that's exciting. So it's kind of our missing middle work has really expanded the Chicago Metro missing middle toolkit that our Chicago Jen, Megan, and our Chicago team did. And on the private sector side, yeah, the so cul-de-sac, right? We're not heavily involved at this point, but it continues to build out. It has 300 residents, 24 businesses. Media continues to cover it fairly regularly. There was an article in BBC just 2 weeks ago in the sustainable travel section, which was super interesting
Huh.
about cul-de-sac. And then our project, we have a really cool project in Florence, Alabama, that's on a former hospital site, which stitches a downtown adjacent neighborhood together with the next adjacent over that's now under construction. I think that's right at about 20 acres. So it's not a huge site, but it's a nice sort of tactical infill, and it has um, a version of our Muse homes that we originally designed for Daybreak, but they're organized in courtyards as opposed to in a linear Muse. And that was the inspiration for what that was. There's a Frank Lloyd Wright house in the neighborhood adjacent to the site, and we were looking at the quad block diagrams that Frank Lloyd Wright drew. I don't think it ever got built. It sort of informed and served as a precedent for like a series of rectilinear courtyards that are kind of the foundation for that. And then there's a neighborhood main street. And then the project you mentioned in Athens is what I would say it's the next iteration of our missing middle neighborhood kit application. It's similar to what we did in the Omaha Metro. It'll be a range of missing middle from triplex up to eightplex. Primarily with that one, we'll have some single family with a, a mixed use center. That's I think it's like 60 or 70,000 square feet of ground floor commercial uses that will be incubated over time, and that got its approvals, planning approvals. It's been about 6 months ago now, so we're now in the architecture phase of that. And so um, Athens is one of those places that just typically it can be very hard to get entitlement, but the city was super excited about this missing middle project because it was different than you can imagine most of what um,
Mm.
developers were proposing, especially those building student housing. And this is not specific to students. I'm sure some students may live in it, but we have found that more like it, the target for most of our missing middle neighborhoods are a more sophisticated renter or buyer looking for something that's not being delivered in the market. So yeah, we're doing a lot of really fun things, I think, and we're busy. Our Chicago office is now up to 5 people.
Oh, wow.
Um,
Great.
the rest of us are in California. So yeah, we're having a lot of fun still. And I, I tell people the reason I started, one of the reasons I started Opticos 25 years ago was that I wanted to be able to still do architecture and planning slash urban design. And nobody would offer me a job that where I could do both. And so I was just like, well, I'll try this on my own. And it worked out. And in those early days, that's when you and I cross paths and write a lot of shredding. As a 1 or 2 person firm, we're sort of being
Yeah.
brought in to do charrettes with a lot of similar clients or the same clients. And I know we worked on projects with you that you were incubating in your practice as well. I can't remember the name of the big T&D project we worked on with you in suburban Kansas City, the ranch project,
Oh, New Longview. Yeah.
New Longview,
Yeah.
beautiful site.
Hmm. Yeah. And it's even all these years, that was 20 years ago. Well, God, 23 or 4 years ago when we designed it, and it's still not fully
Yeah,
built. So
yeah,
these things take a long time.
yeah,
Well, I still look forward
yeah. And the
to,
the the the
oh,
bad.
go ahead.
Can I just say the bad thing about these projects taking so long is if something is done wrong, it's
Yeah.
hard to either correct it or find the opportunity to like correct it or do it better in the next phase. And but it was those early collaborations with folks like yourself and the rest of the Gen X new urbanists were really foundational and inspirational for the work we're doing today. So it
Yeah.
was it was a great it was a good time to and the charrette was a pretty common practice at the time.
No doubt. No doubt. It was a lot of fun. And I look forward to one of these days having you come back here again and do something in the Kansas City area again. So hopefully we can figure out a way to do that.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Kevin.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Dan Perolic, thanks so much for joining and talking about Leon Krier and your experience. And if anybody wants to connect with you or see your work, what do you suggest these days?
Yeah, so I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. So you can follow me on LinkedIn. I post usually a couple times a week. Some of it's sort of updates of our work. Sometimes it's just my thoughts from travel. Sometimes it's sharing articles or resources. That's best. Opticosdesign.com is our website, or missingmiddlehousing.com are our two public faces. And uh, yeah, so I think that's it. And don't hesitate to reach out and connect or ping me directly via LinkedIn to connect or ask a question. I think it would be great to be able to share some of the images that we talked about,
Hmm.
since Krier was such a visual person. And I do want to encourage folks to go to the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture's Krier Archives. Really amazing resource. The Seaside Archives are there as well. So it's a really amazing resource.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. All right, Dan, thanks so much for doing this. Really appreciate your time.